Hi, I'm Marci Kobayashi, and I'm back again with another excerpt from Finding Yoyu. And if you've been following along, then you know that I left you with a bit of a cliffhanger last week. In the story, we had just returned back to Tokyo from spending the New Year holiday with my in-laws in Hiroshima. And during that trip, we had decided we were going to move my husband's parents from Hiroshima to Tokyo. And we were back for a few days in Tokyo to try to figure out which hospital we could transfer his mother to and how to make that happen. And I was updating my husband on the conversation I had with the social worker when the phone call from the police came in. And that's where I left it last week. So I'll jump in from there. The officer called to let us know that he had escorted Otosan home the night before and that Otosan was okay. He also suggested we call the local officer for details and recommended that perhaps it would be a good idea if, in the not-too-distant future, Otosan was not living alone. Oh dear. Akira knew it wouldn't amount to much, but decided to call Otosan first and try to get the story from him before calling the residing officer nearest their home. The conversation wouldn't be easy because, though he had no problem talking on the phone, Otosan was hard of hearing. Unfortunately, every time he guessed at what someone asked him, he would guess a little wrong and his answer would take the conversation in a new direction. When you were trying to get information from him, it was frustrating and his tangents made him seem more senile than he actually was. Not knowing this about him no doubt contributed to the officer's grim evaluation of the situation. On top of it, Otosan loved going into great detail when he told stories. Unfortunately, in his excitement, he sometimes missed a few important points, so you had to be a smart listener and fill in the gaps in between. The conversation with Akira went something like this. Otosan, the police called. What happened last night? Oh, it's okay. I drove the car into the rice field. They took me home in the police car. Nice guys, ha 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 ha. The Miyoshi police, you know. Where were you going? I was going slow, and it was dark, so they drove me home. But where were you going? What were you doing in Miyoshi? The Miyoshi police? They brought me home. Don't worry, the car is fine. What about the rice field? I'm okay. I've still got lots of bread. I had sweet bean buns for breakfast. I ate the whole package. Akira cut the conversation short once Otosan started retelling his adventure from the beginning. He reminded his father that we would be back in Hiroshima on Friday, and Otosan assured us he was fine. Shortly after hanging up, Aunt Hanako called. She was also worried about Otosan. We learned that he had been visiting Aunt Hanako the day before. On his way home, Hanako noticed that Otosan turned right at the corner instead of left to go home. He liked stopping by the local hardware store, so she guessed that he was headed there. She thought it was odd because it was already getting dark and by that hour he usually would have headed straight home. Hanako called the house several times to make sure Otosan got home, but he never picked up, so she had given up and gone to bed. Remembering how easily Otosan got turned around on our way to the hospital over the summer, it didn't surprise me that he got lost on the way home from Aunt Hanako's house, especially since it was already dark. He must have made wrong turn after wrong turn because he ended up somewhere on a back road between Shobara City and Miyoshi City in the opposite direction from home. Hanging up with Aunt Hanako, Akira immediately called the local officer and assured him that we would be back in Hiroshima in a few days and that Otosan would not be alone much longer. After talking with Otosan, Aunt Hanako, and the local police, we had a good picture of what probably happened. The police said they found Otosan driving really slow. He was going so slow that they were concerned and stopped to question him. When the police helped Otosan figure out that he was heading the wrong direction, he tried to turn the car around but drove it into a rice field instead. The officers helped him get the car out, and after talking a bit more, they determined that it wasn't safe for Otosan to drive home alone. That's when they contacted the police station closest to home, and 2 more local officers drove out. One officer drove Otosan's car, while Otosan rode in the police car with the other officer. His car had a few scratches, and the rice field suffered some mild damage, but Otosan was okay. Fortunately, the landowner didn't want to press charges. Though Otosan appeared okay, none of the officers could make heads or tails out of what he was saying. Coming from officers born and raised in Hiroshima, we knew it had nothing to do with Otosan's dialect. From what we could gather, Otosan did understand that he was lost. He was not sure where he had made the wrong turn, but figured if he kept driving slowly, he would eventually recognize where he was and be able to get home. He was a resourceful guy, and I believe eventually he would have made it home on his own. It was also clear from the phone call that Otosan was quite excited about the adventure and, if possible, sounded more proud of the escapade than chagrined. He got an escort from the police, after all. Otosan didn't seem to feel any remorse or shame. He wasn't concerned about having bothered the police, let alone the landowner. Likewise, any concern that this sort of event might make himself and the family look bad was even further from his mind. Of course, that made Akira angry. Akira's reaction was troubling to me. On the surface, I could justify it as coming from Japanese culture and the ever-present need to be mindful of others so that you do not inadvertently cause annoyance, any inconvenience, or become a bother. I'm thinking of the Japanese word or concept meiwaku, which is a blanket word that encompasses all forms of imposing on others by bothering, troubling, annoying, or inconveniencing them in any way. It would be common for any Japanese family member in a similar situation to apologize profusely to the police and want to make amends to the landowner. No one wants to be caught causing meiwaku. I could understand that. What was troubling to me about Akira's reaction was that for this family there was an automatic assumption that Otosan had done something wrong or caused meiwaku. Where was the concern for Otosan's well-being? Was he really okay? No shock? No whiplash? No hidden aches and pains? Where did the caring go? Had it always been this way? Had the family always been quick to judge Otosan and assume he was in the wrong? Or was this a normal Japanese reaction after all? Would I react the same way if Akira were in an accident? Would I worry first about damage to the other person before worrying about Akira? I wasn't sure. I'd been in Japan too long now, and worrying about imposing or causing meiwaku was part of my auto-response. It had become embedded in my cells, and that was not a bad thing. If you want to live in Japan, you must pay attention to how your actions affect others. You must be mindful of the concept of meiwaku. It's part of the give and take and interdependency or interrelatedness of people, whether at home, at work, at school, or in the community. It's also a huge part of the Japanese language. The word meiwaku is used all the time for both sincere apologies and, unfortunately, as lip service whenever you think you might have imposed on someone, even if you did it on purpose and don't feel bad about it. Even so, it is a beautiful part of Japanese culture that I think gets misunderstood. When foreigners are first getting used to living here in Japan, having to worry about what other people think or how their actions will annoy or not annoy someone else feels like a burden. The longer I'm here, the more I feel that being aware of meiwaku and how we impose on each other is being aware of relationship. I'm aware that my actions affect you, and I know that you are aware that your actions affect me. It is impossible to live in isolation from each other as long as we are in human form. Understanding and being aware that I might have caused or will cause you meiwaku means that I also have the opportunity to balance it out, to make amends or make good on my debt to you. It is never ending, and there's always a little relief in that. If you know that you will always be bothering or imposing, causing some kind of meiwaku to someone somewhere, then you can also know that someone somewhere is causing you meiwaku. Around and around we go. Before shifting our focus back to my news from the social worker, we put a note on our to-do list to pick up a thank you gift for the police officers for going out of their way to make sure Otosan got home safely. We had already talked about stopping by to let the resident officer know that the house would be empty. Now it was top on our to-do list. I couldn't believe something like this hadn't happened sooner. It was comical in a way that it happened after we decided to move Otosan in with us. It was oddly reassuring in a divine intervention sort of way. After the call from the police, we knew that we had made the right decision, that the timing was right. I'm grateful it happened and that no one was hurt. Aside from reassuring me of our decision to bring both Otosan and Otosan to Tokyo, this event also convinced me that getting hearing aids was a priority. We could somehow make sense of what Otosan was saying because we knew him. We knew his routine, his stories, and therefore his references. We could tell right away if he didn't catch on to what we were asking and had taken the conversation down a new road. We couldn't assume or expect that other people would understand. That would be meiwaku, after all. A few days later, the drive down to Hiroshima was a breeze. Akira and his brother took turns behind the wheel, and we made it in record time. Otosan was happy to see us. He was still excited about the adventure with the police and proudly showed us his car. There were a few dents, but the car was still in good condition. He went over the whole story again and again. With each retelling, the story expanded with new characters and more detail. Otosan was in high spirits until he realized that he was going back to Tokyo with us. He tried to appeal to us that he was just fine on his own. We asked him to come for at least the winter months. There was still a lot of snow on the ground, and the forecaster was predicting more. This did the trick. If he stayed in Hiroshima, he would need to spend hours shoveling snow every day. If he joined us in Tokyo, he could relax in front of the TV and sleep all day if he wanted. Such an extended holiday was unheard of for him, and he agreed to come at least through the end of March when the snow would melt. Akira's brother and wife worked to shut down the house while Akira and I went to the hospital to take care of paperwork for Okasan's release the following morning. Okasan was surprised to see us and even more surprised to learn that we were transferring her. She quietly shared that she had thought she would die there in the hospital. From the way she said it and her reluctance to move, I couldn't tell whether she meant she thought there was no hope she thought there was no hope left and she was going to die, or that this hospital is where she expected to spend her final days. Either way made sense. Her mother had spent her final days in that same hospital. I knew we had no choice but to move Otosan, but her comment made me feel strange. I was pretty sure that it wasn't her time to pass yet. I felt sad that she had been worrying about this on her own, not knowing that we were advocating for her. How lonely that must have been. I also knew that she had never lived anywhere but this small town. Now, in her final days, we were forcing her to move across the countries to stay in a hospital where she knew none of the doctors, nurses, or fellow patients. I imagine she feared a different kind of loneliness ahead. Otosan survived the 13-hour drive better than we expected. She used to get carsick unless she was sitting in the front seat. For this drive, we had to situate her behind the driver's seat so there was enough room for her chair to recline and enough wiggle room for changing her diaper. We hung her IV from the handle above the door. Surprisingly, Otosan stayed awake for most of that 13-hour drive looking out the window. I was happy for her and hoped she was enjoying it. Some small part of her had to feel good, knowing she was in the car with her boys and that they were in charge now. And so we are finally going to be in Tokyo from here on out. That's all for today. We do make another short trip back to Hiroshima later on in the book. You'll get to hear about that because it's quite an adventure for Akira and his father. But for Otosan and for me, this is it. We are in Tokyo from here on out. So I look forward to sharing more next week. Thanks for tuning in.